Well, hello there to Craig and to the viewers of your YouTube channel. Craig, I'm excited for you that you've started a YouTube channel, sharing a lot of the things that you've been studying about silver, and appreciate that you had a couple questions you wanted to run by me in terms of silver, a revaluation of gold and silver, and some of the things that are happening in the world right now. So hopefully this will be something that will be helpful for you and your audience, and just thinking about what might be coming our way. Again, perhaps worth pointing out is that a lot of this is undecided, and we can make reasonable, educated guesses on how things are going. There's also a degree to which things are up in the air, and I don't know that there's necessarily a specific outcome set. Yet enough clues out there that at least we can dig into some of the things that you've asked and shed a little light on it. So Craig did send me a few questions that I will go through here and provide some insight to. So with that said, let us begin. First question he asks, how do you see us rebuilding in the new world after the financial reset, and what role do you believe silver will play in this new world? Well, assuming that there is a financial reset, perhaps we're seeing some of that play out now already, whether that means that there's actually a reset of gold and silver prices or just a change in the way that the current monetary system is orchestrated. I think the biggest thing that's going to have to change is that at some point, there's going to have to be some resolution to all of the debt and derivatives that are out there. It's not just in the US. We've seen debt loads around the globe that mathematically can't be repaid. A lot of it's being attempted to be repaid just by debasing the currency, and that's causing a lot of issues now as they try to address the inflation that many of us have expected for a long time and finally arrived. Well, I guess has been there for quite a while, but more certainly in the past year or so in particular, where we've seen government inflation numbers around 10%, in some places even higher. Interesting in Germany, where you see producer price inflation extremely high, quite a bit above just the teens. And obviously Germany has that background with the Weimar hyperinflation. So you have some conditions building that are going to have to be addressed at some point. There's the debt that's out there that either is going to be defaulted on overtly or implicitly through more money printing. And there's going to be some point where that will have to be addressed. And I think it's fair to call that a reset. That's why I started getting into gold and silver back in 2009, because as I saw that they weren't paying down the debt here in the US, obviously other places as well, that this was building and there was going to have to be some sort of resolution. Historically, that's been through gold and silver that have their history for thousands of years. And I continue to think that that will be some part of the solution going forward. It was interesting, a couple of weeks ago, we did hear a comment from one of the Dutch central bankers where someone was asked, a reporter was asking him about how they would handle the bond losses on their portfolio and if that was a concern. And he said, no, because we always have our gold revaluation account, essentially saying that you can mark the gold higher to wipe out the bond losses. It certainly was an interesting comment. Didn't seem like he misspoke about what he was saying there, and is certainly suggestive towards some sort of gold or silver revaluation. And again, when you, even aside from his comment, when you think about how some of these things would have to play out, it seems like that would be the most likely solution, and certainly something that I can't necessarily prove or guarantee, but is personally what I've believed is going to happen at some point with the way things are headed right now. So how do I see us rebuilding? Well, I think a lot of the concept of things get weak in the economy and you just patch it over with more money printing and more debt spending, that's going to come to an end, which probably will affect the standard of living in many areas. The idea of just loading things onto the credit card and keep pushing the payments out into the future. I think there's going to be a big effect in that, which in some ways could be good. I mean, there's a lot of, certainly us Americans here, buying a lot of stuff that we don't really inherently need all that much, and perhaps will force us to be a bit more careful in how we're spending our money and the things that we're buying. So certainly a reclassification of wealth in many areas, but perhaps rebuilding for something a little more solid going forward. Could that be similar to what we saw in the Great Depression back in the 1930s? There's certainly the possibility for that, but in terms of rebuilding on something more stable and living within our means mindset, I think that's a reasonable estimate of how this will play out. And you also asked, how will silver play out in this new world? That's an interesting one because there's certainly a lot of people who wonder if we'll get to a barter environment with silver. And I think there's a degree to which that can occur, although perhaps more so just the idea of needing gold and silver, not necessarily as a day-to-day money where we're going to the store and buying our groceries with an ounce of silver. And one of the other questions you mentioned, some of the digital backed currencies, which we'll cover in a moment, but using them as some store of value. So whether that means that we have a gold and silver backed crypto like Kinesis or some of the other ones that are out there that allow us to use that, but more so in the sense of money as a store of value in terms of something backing these currencies, because I think that's been the big problem, is that you have these currencies that can be printed at will with nothing behind them. And I think silver is one of the things that will be one of the things backing that. We've seen some evidence of that with what's happened in Russia earlier this year, and the BRICS nations continuing to talk about building a currency that's backed by a basket of commodities. They had the temporary gold backing to their ruble, and certainly that would make a lot of sense if you saw gold and silver included in that basket of commodities. I think there's a degree to which there are countries in the world that are realizing that there are flaws in the current system, and they're trying to figure out what to do right now. Again, these are some of the things I don't think are actually decided yet, and that people are figuring out, how do we actually go to something different, because I don't know that it's there right yet, but certainly if you saw silver involved in something like that, that would make a lot of sense. Again, with silver, you also have the degree to which so much of it is being consumed in technology and mandates to continue going green, adding more solar panels. Some of the projections that they call for going out the next 10, 20, or 30 years are talking about massive amounts of silver that, A, I think are going to drive the price up, but B, are going to make silver quite in demand. And whatever is left over in terms of being used as money or a backing or just being hoarded by gold and silver stackers, I think will come in quite handy. But you will have that dual use case, for some looking at it as money and a store value, and then others and industry consuming a lot of it for the world that we are headed into. So hopefully that helps on that one. In terms of the next question, where you say, why do you believe the revaluation of gold and silver has taken this long? Well, simply just because people are used to doing things a certain way. There are obviously a lot of vested interest in the system continuing on in a certain way. Traditionally, when gold and silver start going up, that has been the sign that has alerted people to the evidence of some sort of problem in the paper currencies. So with the US government having the world's reserve currency in the dollar and enjoying that privilege and wanting it to stay that way, I think certainly there's a degree to which there's an incentive to keep things in check. and you mentioned key points regarding manipulation. Certainly a word I've used a lot, and as I've thought about it more, whether you call it manipulation or the way the COMEX structure is set up, where you have an infinite supply of contracts that can trade a finite commodity. We've seen that disconnect between what's happening in the paper silver world, especially this year, where there have been a lot of funds selling gold and silver, driving the price down as the Fed has been hiking interest rates. Yet at the same time, we've seen a lot of physical demand for silver that really shows a different story and has been draining the COMEX and LBMA inventories. So whatever word you want to use to describe that, it's left silver in a much different environment in the paper form than what we've seen in the physical form. On the gold side, we have had a lot of government and central bank comments over the years regarding their desire to not see gold at a higher price. Paul Volcker even referenced as much in his book, his last autobiography before he passed away recently, saying that following the collapse of the London gold pool in 1968, they didn't want the price of gold to rise. And I wonder if we're not close to seeing something similar, because back then, US was spending a lot of money, gold was backed by the dollar, and France started redeeming their dollars for gold. That led to Nixon taking us off the gold standard in 1971. And we've gone from a price of $35 an ounce to over 1,700 today. Interesting to imagine, with all the debt, quantitative easing that's been piled on since then, if you have a similar situation and where those prices would go now if you actually just attempted to back the dollars with gold or gold and silver. And obviously politicians don't want to see something like that happen on their watch. So I think on one hand, there's certainly incentive that they want to keep the system going as long as possible. On the other hand, I think it makes sense to some degree, where what else is the Fed supposed to do? Just sit there with their hands in their pockets? Of course, they're going to try to continue this thing without having an overt crash. I'm not sure that they'll be able to pull that off, but just a lot of momentum and infrastructure invested in the current system, which I guess is how these things often go, and they will go on for as long as possible before they end. And usually that's caused by the market, similar to what we saw with the housing bubble in 2008. And when they move, they usually move pretty big. And I continue to expect gold and silver will be the benefit of the collapse of these current bubbles, when people are looking for something that has real value and can be a store of value. And I think we're seeing signs of that play out already. Last question you had here: do you see a happy ending to all this? And do you believe that the good reset takes over versus a bad one in digital government-backed currencies? Well, I think that's an open-ended question. I think that comes down to how we respond as people and citizens. Is there going to be a happy ending? Well, if we go to a system of something more real and removes the ability just to bail out banks every time this system goes bad and print more money, I think in the long term, that would be a really good thing for society. You'd have a more equitable system, not having the never-ending inflation that has been ongoing ever since the Fed was created in 1913, has certainly accelerated over these past couple of years and has made life hard for a lot of people. I remember a couple of weeks ago reading something about how back in the 60s and the 70s, you could have one person in the family working, earning a salary, you could afford to buy a house, and didn't need to be working around the clock. But because of the inflation, now things are a lot harder. People working multiple jobs, in most cases, both parents in the workforce, and a situation that I think is in net much different than the dream that we were told about here in the US. And I think you have a similar dynamic that's taken place in many other countries around the world. So if you go back to something that prevents that from happening, whether that's a full gold backing, a partial gold backing, or even if someone wanted to subscribe to the idea that Bitcoin, at least with a finite supply, was going to back something, anything that removes the ability to just print money at will that often goes to the banks and the elite class first, I think that would lead to a better situation for the people of the globe and would be a happy ending. With that said, you mentioned, will there be the digital bank government currencies? Sure seems like that's already happening to a degree now. I have a friend who was recently in England where he said they've already begun rolling out a lot of these features. And just recently, we heard that the Fed is starting a 12-week test pilot program. So I certainly think they're going to roll these things out. How much they're able to force people to have to use them? Do we get to the point where to go to the supermarket, you need a digital ID or a microchip to buy your groceries? I sure hope not. But that's another one of those things that I don't believe has been decided yet. And how much pushback there is will probably have a big factor in how that plays out. Do people readily accept that and opt in voluntarily? Is there a lot of pushback? I think those are going to play a big role in seeing how that plays out. And I do think there is a good percentage of people who are against these policies, perhaps still a minority when we look at how things played out recently with the whole situation. But I think there's a growing number of people, I'll let you decide for yourself what percentage that might be, that are concerned about these things, don't want the further government control, and perhaps that will decide which of these paths we ultimately head down. So in the end, is there a happy ending? I think that comes down to how we respond as people. I don't think a lot of this is decided, and I do think there is a degree to which when the honest people who just want to live in an honest system band together and support what they believe, that it can have a bigger impact than we've been led to believe. And I like to think that will be the case going forward. So, Craig, I appreciate that you're doing this project and getting different views on these things, because I think that will be instrumental in the time period going forward. Hopefully this helps along with that. And again, I wish you the best of success on this project, and thanks for sharing what you're seeing going on out there.